Welcome to Business Recipe. Every business has a recipe. Here's theirs. Today's recipe, your DNA. 15 million Americans mailed a spit kit to a company and trusted it with the most permanent data they would ever share. Then the company filed for bankruptcy. The founder resigned, and 6 weeks later, she bought it back. 23andMe did not fail as a business. It succeeded as a data extraction operation. Bankruptcy was the exit. Here is what the recipe looks like from the inside. 15 million people provided the ingredients. The method was a decade of data accumulation dressed as a consumer product. The result came out of a Missouri bankruptcy court in July 2025. And who ate it? That is the part nobody in the press release mentioned. But first, the ingredient nobody told you was the main course. 23andMe was founded in 2006 with backing from Google and a promise to democratize personal genomics. By 2021, the company had struck a $300 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline, giving GSK exclusive access to 23andMe's consumer database for drug discovery. From the beginning, the Spit Kit was two businesses in one: the consumer product you bought for $99 and the ingredient supply chain operating behind it. In July 2018, GlaxoSmithKline wired $300 million to 23andMe, not for the kits, not for the brand, for access to the database. GSK received 4 years of exclusive rights to 23andMe's genetic research platform. At that point, 5 million customers, 80% of whom had opted into research sharing. Do the math. $75 million per year for a database that 23andMe had assembled one $99 spit kit at a time. The consumer business was always the funnel. The database was always the product. 3 years later, 23andMe went public through a SPAC merger with Richard Branson's VG Acquisition Corp. The deal valued the company at $3.5 billion. By September 2021, the stock briefly touched $6 billion. Shareholders pumped in $759 million. They were buying a consumer genetics company. They were actually funding the infrastructure for a genetic database whose best customers were pharmaceutical companies, not patients. By fiscal year 2024, consumer kit revenue had fallen 27%, from $299 million to $220 million. Net losses, $66 million for the year. The kit business was dying. The database was not, and in June 2022, 4 years after the GSK deal, 1 year before the data breach, 2 years before bankruptcy, 23andMe quietly updated its privacy policy. 3 sentences. They said, in the event of bankruptcy, your personal information, including genetic data, may be sold or transferred to the new entity. Most customers never read it. By the time it mattered, 15 million people had already mailed their evidence. On March 23, 2025, 23andMe filed for Chapter 11 in the Eastern District of Missouri. Anne Wojcicki resigned as CEO the same day. This is not a detail. It is the mechanism. Under bankruptcy law, a sitting CEO cannot bid to acquire company assets while in a position of control. The resignation was the precondition for the acquisition. In the first auction, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, the biotech company behind Dupixent, bid $256 million and won. The court then did something unusual. It reopened the auction on June 4, 2025. TTAM Research Institute, a nonprofit public benefit corporation founded and led by Wojcicki, came back at $305 million. The bankruptcy court approved the sale on July 7, 2025. The TTAM name stands for Taking the Autism Mission, an organization Wojcicki founded earlier in her career. The nonprofit label changes tax treatment. It does not change who controls the DNA. Here's the specific legal gap that made all of this possible. The bankruptcy code does not include genetic information in its definition of personally identifiable information. Social security numbers are protected. Medical records have some protection. But genomic data, the sequence that encodes your disease risk, your ancestry, your biological relatives, sits in a statutory gap the size of a continent. FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson wrote to the bankruptcy court on March 31st demanding that any buyer expressly agree to honor 23andMe's privacy policies. The court agreed. The FTC had handed 23andMe its own permission slip. The privacy policy it demanded be honored already permitted the transfer. 28 state attorneys general filed a coalition lawsuit to block the data transfer. California, New York, Massachusetts, Iowa, they issued consumer alerts telling residents to delete their data before the sale closed. Senators Warner and Young wrote to the DOJ and FTC asking them to use every available resource. Even they acknowledged the tools did not exist. Approximately 2 million people, 13% of 23andMe's 15 million customers, requested data deletion after the bankruptcy announcement. 87% did not. Their profiles transferred. And then there was the 2023 breach. A credential stuffing attack in October of that year accessed 14,000 accounts, then scraped the DNA relatives' profiles connected to them, reaching 6.9 million users total. The stolen data appeared on breach forums sorted by ethnicity. One batch was labeled Ashkenazi DNA data, another targeted customers of Chinese descent. The company disclosed the breach, paid a settlement, and continued operating. Here's the strongest possible case for what Anne Wojcicki did. First, she paid more than anyone else. TTAM's $305 million outbid Regeneron's $256 million. Regeneron is a pharmaceutical company with shareholders, profit mandates, and no prior relationship with 23andMe's customers. A nonprofit controlled by the founder, someone who built the company, knows the research, and carries reputational risk if the database is misused, may genuinely be the safest possible steward for these profiles. An independent court-appointed privacy ombudsman reviewed the transaction and did not recommend blocking it. Second, the consent argument is not frivolous. 23andMe's privacy policy disclosed the possibility of bankruptcy data transfer. Interim CEO Joseph Selsavage told the Senate hearing directly. When the customer signed up, they agreed to terms of service, which specifically stated that in the event of a bankruptcy sale, the company can transfer their data. The legal record contains documented consent. Here's the problem with both arguments. The privacy clause that authorized the transfer was added in June 2022. Most customers who mailed kits before 2022 did not consent to it. They agreed to a policy that did not contain it. The subsequent update is retroactive consent. And retroactive consent is not consent. It is a legal formality designed to resemble consent after the need for it became apparent. The Steelman holds one truth. Wojcicki may be the best possible steward of this data. It holds a second truth quietly. She built the system that made this exit possible. There is a third argument worth considering. 23andMe's data was always going to end up somewhere. Every company that accumulates this scale of biological information eventually faces the same reckoning. Acquisition, bankruptcy, dissolution, or transition. The choice in a bankruptcy is not between a perfect steward and a flawed one. It is between controlled transfer and a chaotic auction. TTAM is at minimum a known quantity. An unknown pharmaceutical bidder or a private equity firm with no genomics background and no reputational exposure may have been a materially worse outcome for the 15 million people in the database. That is the Steelman at full strength. Now here is why it does not resolve the concern. Here is what the transaction actually transferred. TTAM acquired the Personal Genome Service, 15 million profiles. It acquired the Research Services Division, the Pharma Partnership Arm, the Institutional Relationships, the pipeline GSK helped build. It acquired Lemonade Health, the telehealth company 23andMe bought for $400 million in 2021. The entire operating company, under a nonprofit label. What did shareholders receive? Nothing. Investors who bought at the $6 billion peak lost more than 99% of their position. The database, the only asset that retained real value, passed to a nonprofit controlled by the founder. What did customers receive? A privacy ombudsman report. A promise that the policy would be honored. A window to delete their data, which 87% of them did not use, whether by choice or by not knowing the window existed. Now for the turn. The one that changes how you read this whole story. DNA is not a password. You cannot change it. When 23andMe's October 2023 breach exposed 6.9 million profiles, including health predispositions, ancestry breakdowns, family connections, those customers could not unsubmit their saliva. The liability transferred to them permanently. The asset transferred to Wojcicki cleanly. Professor Margaret Hu, testifying before Congress on June 10, 2025, said it plainly. There is no data privacy law that protects genomic data, no provision in the Bankruptcy Code that prevents this data from being compromised through a bankruptcy auction, and no sufficient remedy for consumers. No remedy. After the fact, for data that cannot be taken back. Consider what that means in concrete terms. Your genomic data was submitted under a terms of service agreement with a company that no longer exists in its original legal form. It is now held by a nonprofit with no publicly traded equity, no shareholder reporting requirement, and no regulatory body with explicit jurisdiction over consumer genomic data storage. The Federal Trade Commission regulates commercial data privacy. The Department of Health and Human Services regulates medical records under HIPAA. Genomic data collected through a consumer spit kit falls cleanly into neither category. The gap between those two regulatory frameworks is exactly where 15 million profiles now reside. The spit kit worked exactly as designed. The company collected the ingredient. The bankruptcy transferred it. And the customers kept the risk. 3 signs you are not the customer. You are the ingredient. Sign 1, the pricing asymmetry. A $99 kit generated a data point worth hundreds of dollars to pharmaceutical researchers. When the price of the product is radically disconnected from the cost of building the infrastructure behind it, ask what the product actually is. 23andMe's $99 kit was the acquisition cost. You were the acquisition. Sign 2, the quiet policy update. When a company updates its privacy policy, particularly the section covering merger, acquisition, or bankruptcy, check the date. 23andMe inserted the bankruptcy transfer clause in June 2022. If a company adds an exit clause before it needs one, it is already thinking about the exit. Sign 3, the nonprofit pivot. Nonprofit status removes the profit motive. It does not remove control, influence, or access. When a founder creates a nonprofit to acquire her own company out of bankruptcy, the question is not whether she has good intentions. The question is, what mechanism now holds her accountable if she doesn't? With a public company, the answer is shareholders, the SEC, and quarterly earnings pressure. With a private nonprofit, the answer is a board she appointed and an IRS Form 990 filed annually. These are not equivalent accountability structures. The DNA you contributed as a consumer product now sits inside an institution governed by the same regulatory standards as a university endowment or a hospital foundation, which is to say, governed primarily by the mission statement. You are not always the consumer. Sometimes you are the crop. If this changed how you read a privacy policy, subscribe to Business Recipe. Next week, the algorithm that decides whether your health insurance claim gets paid before a human ever sees it. Today's recipe, complete. So, what business should we crack open next? Drop the company name in the comments. We read them. If you want more case studies like this one, subscribe. New recipe every Tuesday.